This week, Nelson Mandela was remembered around the world on what would have been his 100th birthday. The former South African president spent a majority of his life working to bring an end to the country's apartheid regime. Much of that work was done during his 27 years in prison. Now, a new book called The Prison Letters of Nelson Mandela is detailing his time behind bars in a way we've never seen before. For the first time, the activist's deeply personal letters to his wife, children, and closest friends are now being published. And joining me is Nelson Mandela's granddaughter, Zamaswazi Dlamini-Mandela. She wrote the foreword for the new book. And also joining us, Sam Venter. She's the editor of the book and a senior researcher at the Nelson Mandela Foundation. Thank you both very much for joining us. Zamaswazi, for much of your childhood, your grandfather was in prison. What was it like to meet him for the first time?
Well, my experience and what I do remember is seeing him when he had actually left Robben Island and he was at Victor Verster, and it was in a home, it was in a family environment. So my family was there, and I mean, essentially, this was really quite remarkable because we had gone all our lives, you know, hearing about him, and my mother always talking about one day he will come out and one day he will be free, but also just why he was there and why he was doing what he was doing and what that meant to the country as well as the family. And so I think it was really quite a joyful time, but at the same time I think it was a bit sad because it made you remember what we lost as a family and what we now had to try and gain, but essentially couldn't because, you know, all that time had gone by.
What I just can't understand after reading his autobiography and spending time there just months before he passed, how was he able to get his captors to become his comrades?
I think he did that even when he was in prison. I mean, I think this book speaks to the man that he was a very consistent person, a very dignified, respectful person. He respected himself and had respect for everyone else. I think over time, the prison wardens and everybody changed around him, but he was always who he was. And I think that will be deeply expressed and people will really get to see that through these letters. So for me, I don't think that he changed. I think that he matured. He says that himself. And so I think that gave people time. I think people had to change to accept and want to see the country go in a different direction and to be able to sit down and want to negotiate peace. You know, I think my grandfather's main purpose was for the good of the country. You know, when he was talking about his release, he wasn't even talking about it for himself. He was actually talking about it for his fellow prisoners. That's what was important to him, that his fellow prisoners would actually leave prison before even himself.
Sam, you edited this book. You spent a decade going through these letters. What stood out to you and why did you feel it's so important?
Well, firstly, I wanted to tell the story about his entire imprisonment. It was through 4 prisons from 1962 till 1990. And I think, as Swati was saying, what stands out is his consistency. He had a vision, and he stuck to that vision. And against all odds, literally, a very brutal period in the beginning, but he kept his dignity, and he had to reach out to his family and parent his children he wasn't going to see until they were older than 16 years old, according to prison regulations. He had to be a husband to his wife, who herself was in prison a lot during that period. And then the leader writing to the prison officials, making demands, being very strong and very statesmanlike all the way through. But his own respect remained for himself and for others.
And Sam, there were some things in this letter that were censored by prison guards. What was left out?
Well, he wasn't allowed to write about politics to his family or about other prisoners or about prison conditions. He could only talk about family matters. He did sometimes write in code, you know, and talk about the family when he meant the ANC. For example, he learned how to do things like that. He learned how to talk about how other prisoners were by using nicknames that the guards wouldn't know about. So he was very smart. He didn't want them to be censored, and often they weren't because he was so clever in the way he wrote them.
At the same time, there were so many sacrifices, even physically, that he had to endure. His eyesight working in that limestone quarry. What do you remember?
Well, I was very young at the time, so I don't really have any experience of that. But what I will say is that, you know, I think the thing that my mom and my aunt did my grandmother, my late grandmother, was to ensure that we knew exactly why he was doing what he was doing. For instance, we were not allowed to celebrate Christmas. So my mother would never put up a Christmas tree because she said, until all the leadership is off Robben Island, we will not celebrate because, you know, there's still so much pain and there's still so much suffering that's going on. So for me, I just remember my grandmother and my mother always ensuring that they kept his memory alive and they spoke about him to us. And they knew why we grew up without a grandfather. You know, if other kids at school talked about they were doing this with their grandparents. I mean, my grandmother was also in and out of jail, and she was very active. So she also wasn't the most normal grandmother either. So I didn't have the experience of saying,
about Winnie Mandela.
Winnie Mandela, yes, my late grandmother. She was also just as active. So I don't have the experiences of saying, oh, I'm going to go sit on my grandfather's lap, you know. But we understood why, because my mother always made sure that she talked about him and she told us exactly why he was doing what he was doing. I think just to lessen the pain for us as well, and for us to be able to just, you know, just understand that, you know, it's not about us and it's not about the family, it's really about the greater good.
There were a great deal of sacrifices that both he and your family made. Not very many people are honored 100 years after their birth.
Well, I mean, I think my grandfather was a very special human being. And I think, but although he didn't like to be treated like he was special, but I don't know how many people or any of us could have done what he did, and in the manner in which he did it, dignified, respectful, resolute, calm, you know, trying to keep his peace at all times, respecting other people first before himself, putting other people first before himself. I'm not sure how many of us really possess those abilities to do that. So I think we need to celebrate him, and we need to remember and learn from that, because I think that we all would like to emulate some of those qualities. And I certainly know that, you know, when I have difficult times, I think about that. And I think, what did my grandfather endure? What did my grandmother endure? Surely if they could endure what they did, I can go through what this little challenge is in my life. So I feel like in modern day, it's good that we can hear his voice, because this is his own words, and you can hear his voice when you're reading it. You know, and it's a beautiful thing. And I think we need it in a world today where we just need to be reminded that so much was given and so much was lost. And hopefully we can, I pray, build from that.
Sam, we also live in an era of such coercive politics right now. What do you think the lesson is that politicians could take away from his words?
I think it's not only politicians that can take away from his words. I think it's all of us, that his message was universal: human rights, love for each other, freedom and democracy. And I think in the world today, where we're beset with racism, sexism, xenophobia, and the rise of fascism in many parts of the world, people need to look to these words and be warned that we cannot go back there in any way, because it would be disastrous for the planet. And so his words, therefore, do not only mean something to South Africa, and not only during that 27-year period, but we can look to those words now to make sure we don't go down that path again.
Powerful stories, powerful letter. Thank you very much for joining us, both of you.
Thank you.